They called the horse Widowmaker for the two men it had already killed. And when old rancher Silas Hargrove led the black stallion out of the corral and handed the reins to a penniless servant girl named Josephine Carter, every hand on the ranch went silent, certain they were about to watch a third death unfold in the dust before supper. If you believe in kindness, in faith, in redemption, and in the kind of second chances that only the Lord and the wide-open West can give a body, I ask you now to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. The year was 1883, and the Hargrove Ranch sprawled across the high plains of Montana Territory like a kingdom unto itself. 40,000 acres of grassland and timber that old Silas Hargrove had carved out of raw wilderness with his own two hands some 30 years before. Josephine Carter had come to that ranch not as a guest, but as a burden passed from household to household. An orphan girl raised in a string of relatives' homes who had finally landed at 19 years old in the kitchen of the Hargrove Ranch house scrubbing pots for a wage barely worth accounting. She had arrived with a single carpet bag and a heart so bruised by years of being unwanted that she had stopped expecting kindness from anyone, and she moved through her days at the ranch with her eyes down and her voice soft, careful never to draw attention to herself in a house where attention had rarely brought her anything good. Silas Hargrove was a hard man, weathered by decades of sun and loss, a widower who had buried a wife and two sons to the various cruelties of frontier life and had, in the process, grown a shell around his heart that most folks in the territory believed impossible to crack. He ran his ranch the way he ran everything else, with an iron discipline that brooked no excuses and precious little warmth, and the hired hands who worked his cattle spoke of him in low voices, respectful of his fairness and wages, but wary of his temper and his silences. He had noticed the new kitchen girl only in passing for the first several months of her employment, a quiet shadow moving between the wash basin and the stove, until the evening he came in from the range to find her alone in the kitchen, sitting on an overturned bucket with her apron pressed to her face, weeping in a way she clearly believed no one would witness. He had not meant to intrude, and in truth a lesser man might have simply backed out and let her grief remain her own. But something in the particular loneliness of her crying, the sound of someone who believed herself entirely without an ally in the world, stopped him in the doorway. He asked her, gruffly but not unkindly, what ailed her, and Josephine, startled and ashamed to be caught, told him the truth because she lacked the strength that evening to construct a polite lie. She told him she had received word that the aunt who'd sent her west, the last living relative who claimed her as kin, had died of the fever back in Missouri, and that she now stood entirely alone in the world, with no family, no home to return to, and no prospects beyond the wages of a kitchen girl who might be dismissed on any employer's whim. She told him she had spent her whole life being handed from one household to the next like an unwanted parcel, and that she had simply grown tired, bone tired, of being nobody's daughter and nobody's choice. Silas said nothing for a long moment, and Josephine braced herself for the awkward dismissal she felt certain was coming. But instead the old rancher pulled a chair from the table and sat down across from her, his weathered face unreadable in the lamplight, and he told her something that surprised them both. He said that a ranch such as his required more than cattle and hired hands to keep it alive, that it required people who understood the meaning of belonging somewhere, of being claimed rather than merely tolerated, and that he had watched her these past months work harder and complain less than any hand he currently employed. He told her that he did not offer charity, for charity built nothing lasting, but that he was prepared to offer her something else entirely, if she had the courage to accept it. The following morning, before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge, Silas led Josephine out to the corral where the ranch's most notorious horse stood watching them with wild, distrustful eyes. Widowmaker was a magnificent black stallion, 17 hands of raw muscle and violent temper, a horse so dangerous that Silas had long ago given orders that no hand was to attempt riding him. Not since the animal had thrown and trampled a cowboy named Otis Fairweather 2 summers past, breaking the man's leg so badly he'd never work cattle again. And before that had killed outright a drifter who'd wagered he could tame any horse in the territory. The other hands had gathered at the fence rail by then, drawn by the unusual sight of the old rancher walking a kitchen girl toward the most feared animal on the ranch, and their murmurs carried on the morning air, half curiosity and half dread, certain they were witnessing either a cruel joke or a tragedy in the making. Silas placed the reins in Josephine's trembling hands and told her plainly that the horse was hers now, hers to keep or hers to fail with, and that what she did with that stallion would tell him, and tell her, exactly what kind of woman she intended to become. He said that a horse like Widowmaker had been beaten and mishandled by careless owners before ever coming to the Hargrove Ranch, that his savagery was not born in him, but had been carved into him by cruelty, and that perhaps, Silas said, looking at her with an intensity she had never seen from him before, perhaps a creature that had been discarded and mistreated might recognize something in another creature who understood exactly what that felt like. Josephine stood frozen at the rail, terror climbing her throat, certain the old man had lost his senses or was testing her in some cruel fashion she did not yet understand. But looking into Silas Hargrove's weathered face, she saw no cruelty there at all, only a strange and solemn faith that unsettled her more than any doubt could have. For 3 days she did not attempt to ride the animal at all, and the hands who watched from a distance assumed she had simply been too frightened, a judgment they did not trouble to hide behind their smirks. Instead, Josephine spent those days standing quietly at the corral fence for hours at a stretch, saying nothing, simply being present, the way she herself had once longed for someone to be present with her without demand or expectation. She brought the stallion no sugar, made no false promises with soft words, understood instinctively that an animal so betrayed by careless hands would trust nothing offered too eagerly. On the 4th morning, she entered the corral for the first time, moving with the same careful quiet she had spent a lifetime perfecting in households that did not want her noise. And though Widowmaker reared and screamed and drove her twice against the fence rail hard enough to bruise her ribs, she did not run, and she did not strike him. And by the evening of that 4th day, the great black horse stood still enough to let her hand rest, trembling, against the ridge of his neck. Word of the strange partnership spread through the ranch and beyond it, out to the small settlement of Larkspur Crossing, where the ranch hands drank their wages away on Saturday nights. And opinions divided sharply between those who believed old Hargrove had finally gone soft in the head, and those who whispered there was something almost sacred in what they were witnessing, a broken girl and a broken horse finding in each other a reason to stop being broken. Silas himself said little about it, though the hands noticed he took to watching the corral most evenings from the porch of the ranch house, his pipe unlit in his hand, his face carrying an expression none of them could quite name. What none of them knew, save perhaps Silas himself, was that the old rancher saw in Josephine something of his late wife's own quiet steadiness, and something of the daughter he had lost to scarlet fever 30 years before ever having the chance to grow into a young woman such as this one. It took the better part of 2 months before Josephine set the stallion's back for the first time, and when she did, the entire ranch seemed to hold its breath as one. Widowmaker did not throw her. He did not bolt or rear or attempt the violence that had cost 2 men their health and their lives. He simply stood, muscles coiled and quivering beneath her, and then, at some silent signal only the 2 of them understood, began to walk, slow and deliberate, along the corral fence while the hired hand stood in stunned silence, and old Silas Hargrove, watching from the porch, allowed himself for the first time in 3 decades to weep openly in front of his men, though he would later claim it was dust in his eyes and nothing more. But the frontier rarely allowed peace to settle for long without testing it, and trouble arrived at the Hargrove Ranch that autumn in the form of a land speculator named Virgil Thackeray, a smooth-talking man from back east who had spent 2 years attempting to pressure Silas into selling off the northern grazing pastures for a fraction of their worth, land Thackeray intended to resell to the approaching railroad at enormous profit. Silas had refused him at every turn, and Thackeray, growing desperate as his financing deadline approached, resorted to methods considerably less civil than negotiation. Hired riders began appearing at the edges of Hargrove land under cover of darkness, cutting fence lines and spooking cattle toward the ravines. And one terrible night, as an early autumn storm rolled black and violent across the plains, someone set fire to the northern hay barn, the blaze visible for miles against the churning sky. It was Josephine, unable to sleep with the storm rattling the windows, who first smelled the smoke and raised the alarm that saved the main house and half the herd from following the barn into ruin. But in the chaos of bucket lines and panicked animals, Silas Hargrove, 61 years old and moving through smoke to free trapped horses from the burning structure, was struck by a falling beam and pinned beneath it, the fire closing in around him with a speed that left the hands who witnessed it certain they were about to lose the only father most of them had ever truly respected. It was Josephine who did not hesitate, who ran into the smoke and heat with her apron pressed over her mouth, who found the old man pinned and bleeding and somehow, through strength she did not know she possessed, worked the beam loose enough to drag him clear before the roof came down entire seconds later in a roar of flame and collapsing timber. Silas survived, though the burns on his arms and the smoke in his lungs kept him abed for the better part of a month. And it was during that long, uncertain recovery that he finally told Josephine the truth of what Thackeray had been attempting and the truth of his own fear that he would not live to see the ranch through the fight ahead. Sheriff Dale Merritt of Larkspur Crossing was summoned, and though proving Thackeray's hand in the arson took the better part of 2 weeks, a confession finally wrung from one of the hired riders after his conscience proved weaker than his loyalty. Justice arrived as it so often did on the frontier, plain and unhurried but certain. Thackeray was run out of the territory in disgrace, his railroad financing collapsing along with his scheme, and the Hargrove Ranch, battered but unbroken, began the slow work of rebuilding. It was during that rebuilding that Silas Hargrove, still bandaged and moving slowly, called Josephine into his study one November evening and told her that he had spent the weeks of his recovery thinking hard on matters he had long avoided, namely the question of what would become of the ranch when age or misfortune finally claimed him for good, given that he had no living children to inherit what he'd spent his whole life building. He told her that he had watched her tame a horse the whole territory had given up on, had watched her run into a burning barn without a heartbeat's hesitation to save a man who was, in the truest accounting, nothing more to her than an employer, and that he had come to understand something in these past months that his own grief had kept him from seeing clearly for 30 years. He told her that family was not only a matter of blood, that sometimes the Lord sent a person exactly the family they needed in a shape they never expected, and he asked her, with more vulnerability than the hardened old rancher had shown any living soul since burying his wife, whether she would consider staying on not as a kitchen girl, but as his legal ward and heir, the daughter the fever had taken from him replaced, not in memory, but in genuine, living presence. Josephine wept then as she had wept in that kitchen so many months before, though these tears carried an entirely different weight, and she told him that she had spent her whole life being passed from house to house, like a burden nobody quite wanted to claim, and that she had never once believed herself worth the choosing, worth the deliberate act of a family, selecting her rather than simply enduring her. She told him that riding Widowmaker had taught her something she hadn't fully understood until this very moment, that broken things were not the same as worthless things, that a creature could be handled cruelly by the world and still, given patience and honest care, become something magnificent. Silas told her that was precisely the lesson he had hoped the horse would teach her, though he confessed with a rare smile that he had hoped it might take rather less nearly getting her killed to arrive at it. Now, before we come to the end of this story, I want to ask you something. Wherever you are watching from tonight, whatever town or city or quiet corner of the world you call home, I would love for you to leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And tell me, too, what lesson this story stirred in your own heart. Was it the truth that broken people, like broken horses, are not beyond redemption? The reminder that family can be chosen as much as it is born? Or perhaps it was the quiet lesson that sometimes the very thing everyone fears in us is only waiting for someone patient enough to see the good still buried underneath. Josephine Carter did become Silas Hargrove's legal ward that winter, and in the years that followed, as she grew into a woman known throughout the territory not for the tragedy of her orphan childhood, but for the steady, capable hand with which she ran cattle and broke horses, and eventually, upon old Silas's peaceful passing many years later, inherited and expanded the ranch into one of the finest in Montana territory. She kept Widowmaker until the great stallion's dying day, riding him across those 40,000 acres with a freedom she had once believed impossible for a girl nobody had ever chosen to want. She often told the story, in later years, to the orphaned and struggling young hand she herself took in and gave second chances the way Silas had once given one to her. That the day an old rancher handed her the reins of the most savage horse on the ranch was not a punishment or a test of her worth, but the very first time in her whole life that someone had looked at her and seen not a burden to be managed, but a soul worth investing in, worth believing in, worth loving without condition. If this story touched your heart even a little tonight, if it reminded you that kindness costs us something and gives back so much more, that faith carries us through even our darkest and loneliest hours, and that second chances are real and worth believing in, then please take a moment to like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, share it with someone who might need these words today, and subscribe for more stories like Josephine's. Thank you for riding along with me through this one, friends, and until next time, may you always have the courage to take hold of the reins life hands you, wild and frightening as they may seem, because sometimes the very thing everyone else has given up on is the thing that ends up carrying you home.